All right, so let's start the next session, and it's really a great pleasure to have Bruno Olshausen here, who is a local at Berkeley, and Bruno has done a lot of work on various aspects of cognition and visual systems, things like coding, representations of objects, a lot of work in perception of neuroscience, vision, and machine learning. We're very much looking forward to his insights, and how generalization can be thought of from the neuroscience point of view, and what it sort of tells us about the uncertain futures of generalization.
Well, thanks a lot, Matus, for inviting me and for having me. It's great to be here. So yeah, I'd like to share with you some of the work we're doing in the lab, trying to understand how animals compute with their brains and how, especially, they generalize, how they build models of the world that allow them to survive in the world. And so first begin just by introducing the group that I work with here at Berkeley, the Redwood Center for Theoretical Neuroscience. We're located exactly in the opposite corner of campus from here in Warren Hall, this relatively new location for us on campus. Basically, we're a group of students and postdocs and faculty, many with backgrounds in physics and math and computer science, and also neuroscience and vision science. And we're trying to bring ideas together from these different fields to understand how brains compute. And so I'll just begin by introducing specifically the people who were really instrumental in the work that I'll be talking about here. Chris Kim, who I just learned is in the audience here, so he's going to be able to answer some questions as they come up. And this is work together he did with a visiting student from France, a master's student from France, Sonia Mazolet. And also very much inspired by Pentti Kanerva and his framework of hyperdimensional computing, which we'll get into in a bit. And Fritz Sommer, who's another PI in the Redwood Center, who was instrumental in developing this Resonator network that they'll be talking about together with Paxton Frady, who's not shown here, and Anthony Thomas, who is a postdoc working with Fritz, and helpful in proving many of the theorems that in Chris's work on residue number systems. Okay, so this is kind of what we'll be going through. I'd like to begin just by making a few observations about animal intelligence. And the reason why I think it might be relevant to the topic here is because these are really amazing examples of being able to solve this problem of generalization. And in fact, the very objective function of evolution was the ability to behave effectively in unknown future settings. That's really kind of what animals have to do to survive. And that is, to survive in the physical world, you're always getting novel situations thrown at you. And if you can't deal with that, if you're going to be thrown off course and can't deal with that, then you're not going to survive. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. And then sort of as a bridge between this and this, go into a little bit of the physics of computations, physical constraints of computation, because this is an important aspect of how brains compute, is that they have to deal with these physical constraints. And in fact, we as engineers and computer scientists also have to worry about this too. And so far, we've probably not been worrying about it as much as we should be. And then, so I'll give two examples of these computational problems we think brains are solving. One is factorization. So this allows us to deal with novel situations by taking this complex set of data that's thrown at us and trying to factorize it in terms of simpler things that we are familiar with. And then specific example, this gets into Chris Kim's work on equivariant representation using residue number systems. Okay, so, and then maybe just in terms of time, I think I'm just looking at the clock here to just tell me when I'm out of time. So, all right. So let's just begin with some observations about animal intelligence. And so these are a few different animals we could look at, but one in particular is the jumping spider, which is amazing just for many reasons, but in particular for the design of its visual system. It has a very sophisticated visual system consisting of 8 eyes. 2 of those eyes are very high resolution in the front with these lenses that are attached to the exoskeleton. And the retina is at the back of these 2 forward-looking eyes. And the retina is basically a one-dimensional strip. And the way it sort of builds an image of the world is by taking that one-dimensional strip and scanning it back and forth. And you can see that in this one-day-old jumping spider. When they're very young, the exoskeleton is translucent. And so you can see through it. And you can see these tubes moving back and forth inside the head. And so it's taking this one-dimensional retina and scanning it back and forth to build up some kind of an image. Those high-resolution images that it gets here are still kind of tunnel vision, very narrow field of view. And so it uses these other eyes on the side of its head to get a wide field of view, sort of through a fisheye type lens, but at much lower resolution. And it uses these eyes on the side of its head to detect objects of interest. And then it orients its head towards them to image it with these high resolution eyes to find prey and also for courtship behavior and so forth. Okay, so they're very good at pattern recognition and at navigation in complex environments. And it's also worth mentioning that when we look at this animal, it looks very strange to us. It looks very foreign, but this is in fact how vision began 500 million years ago. Okay, so these animals have been around since the Cambrian explosion, and this is how vision began, and it's very much a part of us, this active vision strategy, using a dynamic visual system that moves the eye around and so forth. It doesn't feel like that, and so, but it is very much that same kind of thing. Okay, so this is some of the amazing things they can do in the wild. If what they've observed is that in the wild, when a jumping spider sees a prey item, then if it's too far away to jump at, then they'll navigate to it. They'll sort of have to, crawl through a certain path to it. And what they notice is that along the way, as it's moving towards that prey item, it will make these sort of reorienting turns as though to check, is it still there? And the angle that they turn at is always the appropriate angle for where the object is now relative to its new location in the environment. And so they were kind of wondering, well, how does it do that? Does it have some internal representation of these targets in the visual environment and where they are as they move along, doing some kind of path integration? And it appears that that's the case. And this was done a control experiment here where they have the animal moving along this one-dimensional track, starting at this location, and then there's a target, a prey item out here that initially sees at this angle, and then it moves along this track, and the track has walls so that it occludes its view, and it's only certain points there's a gap. And when the animal gets in that gap and makes a turn, then they can look at the angle that it turns at, relative to its new position. And this is just kind of showing the predicted angle, based on the correct new angle in the environment versus what it actually does. And you can see that it's doing a pretty good job. Okay, so it seems to have a good idea of where it is in the world and where things are, and updating this representation about where things are as it moves through the 3D world. Another stellar example is the desert ant, which has this sort of typical behavior where when it forages away from its nest, so N marks the nest, and it does this kind of foraging behavior and takes this kind of somewhat meandering path looking for food. When it finally finds food at this point marked F, then it wants to tell the other ants in the colony where that is. And so when it goes back to the nest, it doesn't sort of follow the same meandering path. It takes a straight beeline route as though it always knew where the nest was all along. Okay. And so this kind of begs the question is like, what kind of a representation does it have in its brain about where it is in the world and where these important landmarks are relative to it, and how does it update these representations? Okay, and a really stunning development in neuroscience. Now we know a lot about how that's done in flies, specifically in the fruit fly. So the fruit fly has a similar problem, is it needs to know where is it going in the world. It's not just kind of randomly flying around. It has some sense of where it is in the environment and where food sources are and so forth and how to get there. And it has these visual systems which compose a compound eye, so a very different type of eye than the jumping spider, but more similar to all the insects have these compound eyes. And so what they found is that deep inside the fly's brain, there's this structure called the ellipsoid body, which is basically a ring of neurons. It's kind of a ring-shaped structure, a sort of donut-shaped structure of neurons that are interconnected to each other. And when you do calcium imaging, 2-photon calcium imaging of these neurons in this structure, this is what they see. This is just sort of marking the active neurons where it sort of lights up here. It's indicating which neurons are active within that ring as the fly is navigating in a virtual world. So here what is basically, they have electrodes in its head. So of course its head is stationary. And then they have this sort of styrofoam ball that it can walk along and navigate. And so it has this sense, and there's also sometimes a visual stimuli in this environment. It has this sense that it's moving around in a world, okay? And so this is just on the plot here at the right, it's just showing I'm sorry, yeah, one more time. If you just read out the activity in this ring and compare that to its actual heading in this artificial environment, it does a very, very good and accurate job. Okay, so this is really stunning because it's very deep inside the nervous system that is building up an explicit representation, an abstract representation of where it is in the world. Okay, this is not reflecting any one sensor. There's no sensor for heading. This is something that has to compute from a collection of visual information, from other internal cues from the motor system. All these other signals come in it. And from this, it synthesizes and creates internally this explicit neural representation of where it's heading in the world. Okay, so these are some of the insights that people are getting. And also, it's just worth mentioning, by the way, another stunning recent development in neuroscience is now a team of scientists have reconstructed the complete connectome of the fly brain. Yeah, question.
How would you verify that it means that, right? This prediction is accurate.
Yeah, that's what's being shown here. I mean, so they can basically on this trackball, they can measure how that styrofoam ball is moving. Okay, so they have, so you have a sort of a ground truth of where the fly is actually, its direction that it's moving in the world, in its virtual world, and then that's being compared to just this representation of where it thinks it is. Does that answer your question? Sorry, yeah.
Is there any element of memory in that, or is this all done on the fly?
So to speak. So let's see. But by the way, the expert on this is Yvette Fisher on campus. She's a recent addition to the faculty, so she can answer all these questions. But I'm not sure about memory per se, but there's definitely a persistence of activity. So you can turn off all the lights in the room, and you still see this bump of activity. And if the fly is not moving, that bump is stable. Okay, the bump does not move, and the bump will only move if the fly actually changes its orientation. So there's a certain memory aspect to a persistence in that activity. It's holding a state. It's not just reflecting some sensory information directly. Yeah.
You emphasize that it's explicit. What did you mean with that?
Well, it's a very easy to read out, right? I mean, that would be the definition of it explicit, right? It's just sort of like, there it is, right? If you want to know which direction you're heading, you just kind of look at that neuron as a very simple system, as opposed to kind of being deeply embedded in a very complex, entangled way, right? Yeah. I mean, another way to think about it is all the sensory information coming into it from the visual system and also proprioceptive from the motor system and so forth, that is an implicit representation of where it's heading in the world. That has all the information you need to know where you're heading. It's just, you have to sort of do a lot of work to pull it out. And that's what this seems to have done. Yeah, that's what's kind of interesting about it. Yeah.
But it is like specific to the environment where it learns the representation. Like if it saw a different.
Yeah. So that's a good question of how this is learned or how it determines, because it's not sort of pointing to magnetic north or anything like that. So the idea is that when it goes into an environment, it sort of sets a reference frame and then it sticks with that. But where it sort of puts the 0 degree coordinate of this ring is rather arbitrary with respect to a certain environment. So there is a sort of maybe sort of quick adaptation or something that sort of has to be set down with respect to the world. And this is something Yvette Fisher is trying to understand here at Berkeley, is this sort of quick learning that has to happen with each environment that it lives into.
But in terms of like changes in visual inputs and audio inputs and everything, I guess visual inputs, if it changed like lights completely, it will still have use the same cells for exactly the same way.
Oh yeah, exactly. Yeah, for that environment, yeah, you can have different stimuli here. It's not just a direct reflection of the sensory sensory world. It's basically, it's building up this internal representation of heading. It's an abstract representation. Yeah.
And if you rotate that ring, the fly thinks that you're rotating the fly.
By that's a. I mean, if you like, what do you mean? Like if you made artificial stimulation here.
Yeah. You could like make this like big blob of like bright up in the lower left, and it should then believe that you just rotated it.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. That'd be a great experiment, and we could ask the fly what it what it thinks. Yeah, that's cool. Right. So it's super fascinating, I think. And so, you know, what the world of what these small animals are doing and small brains are doing is really starting to open up, and a lot of exciting avenues of inquiry, and we're learning a lot. But I think one thing is becoming clear is that even these very small animals, very small brains, seem to be building internal models of the world. And they use these internal models to deal with novel situations. They're not just simply bombarded. They're not swimming in data. They take this data that they get massive amounts of data, and they break it down into things that they can, these internal representations that they can use to guide behavior in the environment. And they can do this robustly. Okay, yeah, and I mentioned this is, again, just to say is a side point at very exciting times that, you know, all 139,355 neurons have been mapped out, and their connections, how they're interconnected to each other. And this is really a lot of things that we're going to be able to learn from this. Yeah, I'm sorry. Is that Terry over there? Oh no, sorry. I'm sorry. I don't know. Well, the previous one, I mean, that was well known as the nematode worm, C. elegans. They had a. Well, it's a huge step. Yeah. The C. elegans was like, you know, what, 300 neurons, I think, or something like that, right? So, and here's a, you know, 100, out of 100,000. So, and a much more complex system forming these. And for example, that ring that for the ellipsoid body, they have all those connections of those neurons in the ellipsoid body, and then the neurons that feed into it. So you can really kind of now build up a very good computational model of how it's computing that representation from visual cues and so forth, and how it updates it. Yeah.
The connectome isn't just a representation of the brain, or can it actually be used as a model? Can you like pass signals to them?
Well, that's the dream, is that, you know, if you have enough specificity in the connections, then you could pass signals through it and simulate part of it, right? And it's starting to give people, I think the way to look at it right now, it doesn't give you very precise information about connectivity, but it gives you important constraints. And with those constraints, a huge amount of constraints, right? Now you can sort of make plausible guesses about what those connection strengths are, and maybe test various hypotheses and theories about what might be going on, right? So I would call it a huge step along the way. Yeah.
I would just add that there's a companion paper where they simulate this brain.
Oh yeah.
Too, and they show stimuli like a factory stimuli, and they show responses in different cortical regions and correspond that to measurements in fly brains.
Yeah.
So it's quite.
We can just run this as a model.
You can download it on GitHub and run it in 5
Yeah,
minutes.
yeah. It's called Flywire AI or something like that, simulating the fly on your laptop, so to speak. Yeah.
I'm curious, so how fixed is this between flies and throughout development? Like you have like this super exact number of neurons, and they connect them.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the beautiful thing about it is, you know, when you record from these neurons, there's, you know, a specific set number of them, and, you know, every fly has the same neurons and it's same connections, and it's like a machine, basically.
That's not necessarily the hypothesis for like really brain, is it?
No, well, I would sort of lean to it. We're more like the fly than we'd like to believe. That we're probably born with a lot of very pre-specified circuits, you know, very detailed wiring, and then, you know, a lot of that is shaped by experience, obviously, memory and learning and things like that. But there's much more. There's probably hardwired. That's my own personal kind of speculation and bias. But yeah. Okay, so I didn't come here to talk about the fly, but I'm glad there are all these questions, because it is indeed fascinating, and to see what these animals can do. And again, it kind of makes sense that you would have to be able to do this kind of thing if you want to survive in a complex three-dimensional world. Okay, so we'd like to think about then, you know, how do we build models of the computations that underlie these abilities to do this? And in order to do this, I think we really need to confront head-on the physical constraints of computation. And this is, I think, one area in which right now, currently, modern AI is actually diverging very heavily from biology. So at the left, this is the latest NVIDIA Blackwell GPU chip. It has a stunning 200 billion transistors in it. Okay, that's something really to behold. That number is roughly about a square inch in size, and it consumes about a kilowatt of power. And here, what I've done is shown to scale. Actually, I don't know if I showed the animation earlier, but they have the jumping spider. This is just a little animation of the jumping spider looking around the world and exploring. And I'm showing basically approximately to scale with this chip here. Okay. And so I think it's needless to say, it seem like two very different things, right? This is what modern AI is building right now. This is what biology built, is a system that can be autonomous in the actual 3D physical world and do all the computation in a very small amount of space at very low power. Okay, that's the problem that biology had to solve 500 million years ago, and that's the problem it solved in creating our brains as well. Okay, and so the point here I want to try to make is that if we think about how we create models, either in artificial intelligence or in computational neuroscience, trying to capture the computations going on in the brain, one way of approaching that is just to say, well, I want to make a model that performs such and such function. Like I want to make a neural network that recognizes objects and images. That's convolutional neural networks. Okay, and I'm just going to train it, and if I can get it to perform well on ImageNet, then wow, that's amazing. Maybe that will teach me something about how the brain works. Okay, and if I can do that, then I can recognize multiple objects and so forth. And just sort of marching along this axis of functional competence, trying to build more and more complex models that exhibit increasingly impressive performance. And then as you start to consume megawatts, gigawatts of power, and you're needing a nuclear power plant to power your computational infrastructure, then you think, okay, we need to back off and think about how to make this efficient. And you say, okay, well, I'm up here. Now I'll think about moving over here this way. But the question is, can you do that? Have you worked yourself into a cul-de-sac with these specific algorithms and representations that you went to along this path without thinking about the computational efficiency? Okay, and so what biology undoubtedly did is it just moved in this direction. Okay, so it had, and what I would like to suggest here is that perhaps the data structures and the representations that we use are intimately intertwined with the physics of computation. You cannot divorce the two. Okay, and that may sort of sound like sacrilege to say that here in the Science Institute, and I'm sorry, Shafi, but because computer science by design, in fact, is built on this assumption that the computational model can be thought of separately from the physical implementation. So we can take the Turing machine, we can implement it with rocks, we can implement it with transistors or vacuum tubes, it doesn't really matter. Okay, so we have this abstraction of the computation that lives apart from the physical implementation. But what people at Intel and TSMC and all these other places are discovering now and coming head to head with as they run against the end of Moore's law is that we can't afford to do that anymore. Okay, we can't afford to have this fiction of this sort of computational system that's going to do everything perfectly for us. And so we have to think about physical limitations, noise, power, and how all those things interact. And that's going to influence the kind of representations we use and the kind of algorithms that we use. And we now have to think about those conjointly. And this is definitely what biology did in going to here and then creating humans. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Well, okay, it started somewhere, but yeah.
I know, I'm just saying, but like, it took that arrow. The end part of the arrow. You get part of the arrow. That didn't happen. It didn't start with current models.
No, it didn't start. Didn't start at current models. Yeah. It started, Genesis in the Bible or whatever. I mean, yeah. So I don't know where the origin would be, but I'm just saying, like, as you went from simpler organisms, let's say a nematode, or even to get to a nematode from a single-celled animal, to multicellular animals, and then to jumping spiders, and then eventually to humans, this trajectory that it's taking is heavily influenced by physical factors. Okay, like signal to noise ratio, how much power it's going to consume, and how much space do I need to get all these signals represented in. That's really, I think, the point I'm making, that it's sort of these things were considered jointly. And this point really comes across, by the way, a beautiful book to read about this is Sterling and Laughlin's book on principles of neural design, which really kind of spells out all these design principles that biology uses in constructing circuits, and how those are all put together. Yeah.
So maybe this is a question for later, for not to answer it later, but is it clear that the biological computational systems are in fact more efficient than these GPU chips or whatever? I mean, in the sense of like how much compute they're actually doing for how much energy. I mean, it's because you compare it to your GPT-10 or whatever to the Spider, it's also doing lots of other stuff the Spider is not doing. Right? So
that's a very good point. I mean, Right. I think one might be able to argue that Blackwell GPU, it's putting just enough energy into it to do exactly what it was designed to do, right? I guess the point I'm making is that what it was designed to do is doing a very different thing than what biology is doing. For example, to the engineer who designed that chip, every transistor there is a switch. And they are very concerned with being able to take those switches and turn them on or off with 100% reliability. I don't want that switch to go halfway off, right?
That's actually, I mean, it seems like you're arguing that in order to be more energy efficient, we have to not separate between the small computation and the computation we're doing. And what I'm asking is, is there evidence for that? Is there that in fact, because I mean, not thinking actually suggests otherwise, the other way.
I can't prove that. I'm suggesting it, right? Yeah. So I don't have hard evidence of that, but this is kind of like, I'm just giving you like a personal philosophy that influences a lot of my own kind of model development. But maybe one example, again, I'll just give is that, what's going on with the Blackwell GPU is that you're spending a lot of energy to make that switch very reliable, okay? To create a 1 or a 0. And in the end, what they're doing is they're taking those 1s and 0s and assembling them together to represent numbers, which are then sent in digital multipliers and adder circuits and so forth. And so the question is, well, if you want to do an addition multiplication, maybe there was a different starting point because that transistor actually had a continuum it could represent, right? It was really occupying a continuum of voltages, and perhaps you could utilize that continuum. And this is what Carver-Mead advocated for many years ago. And this is sort of the basis of neuromorphic computing and things like that. So people trying to approach the, rather than taking the silicon and coercing it into doing something that you wanted to do, the philosophy is listen to what the silicon naturally does and then use that as the computational primitive. Okay, so for example, we can multiply by passing current through a resistor and things like that, right? So that, I think that's the kind of, that's what I'm sort of getting at here. Okay, if you want to multiply, maybe there's more efficient ways to do it in the end.
Bruno,
yeah.
I actually think that's the basis of a lot of these questions. There's an extremely interesting mathematical question, which is to go in the reverse direction, which is to try to make a correct framework, which can get as the energy optimum one of these strange shapes. So for me, the fact that nature chose to actually make a physical ellipse to map elliptical orientation in the world is a completely jarring concept. So it would be interesting to go in the opposite direction, try to design a theorem where we actually end up with that.
Very cool. Yeah.
I agree with that. I mean, I guess my thinking is like thinking of communication, and there people also try to do communication. Thought that analog communication, taking advantage of exactly the fact that we can do things in between that's the way to go. And then Shannon told us that no, that's not true. The optimal thing is in fact to completely separate between the channel and what we're transmitting. And
well, you can separate them, right? But there's also joint source channel coding, and those can be as optimal and sometimes and more effective, right? And I think that's maybe sort of related to this idea here. I don't think he said you have to separate them, but you can separate them, right? You can separate them, and that's a useful design strategy. And I guess. Yeah, but again, sort of what I'm serious here is maybe there's places where you don't want to separate them, because if you have to think about the hardware, then and the physical substrate that it's implemented in, that's going to turn out to be important. Okay, so as an example of maybe the kinds of different computational primitives that one is led to by thinking about brains and how they work, this is just one of many examples, is that you see this theme of recurrent computation. So circuits in the brain are taking information and circulating it around in loops. Feedback loops are everywhere. Okay, so if nucleus A projects to nucleus B, then B projects back to A. It doesn't just take that answer and send it onto another layer in the neural network. It passes back and it goes back to the first layer and changes the representation of the first layer based on what the second layer is saying, and so forth. And even within layers of representation, so these are just showing neurons within visual cortex, and the canonical microcircuit that's been untangled about how these neurons within cortex are interconnected, and there are very strong feedback loops within different layers. So these neurons within layer 4, within layer 2, 3, they're all connecting back and forth to each other. So one neuron sends a signal to another, which sends a signal back to it, and so forth. Not directly back to it, but to a whole bunch of other neurons, including it. Okay. And so the question is, well, how do we compute with such systems? How do we compute with feedback loops? And this is, of course, what Hopfield networks do. And so that becomes a useful and very powerful kind of computational model to think about, as we'll see. Okay, so then, so maybe we'll just move on to here to sort of make things a little more concrete. So how do we solve some of these problems in factorization and what in perception? And what I'm going to argue is that factorization is a really key computational primitive that brains need to solve. And because what it does is it allows us to take the sensory data that's coming in and break it into things that we are familiar with and can reason about. Okay, so here's just a simple example of that. If I think about how a shape would be represented on the retina in terms of the photoreceptors, so each of these cells in this grid here represents like a different photoreceptor in the retina. And if I had a shape projected on the retina at one certain position, that would correspond to a point in a 100-dimensional space. Okay, so just that particular instantiation, since there's 100 pixels here, then that would be one point in this 100-dimensional space. And now as that E moves to a different position, this exact same pattern, but simply in a different position on the array, that's just simply another point in this 100-dimensional space. Okay, so the question is, what about this E that's halfway between them in that image array? That's yet another point in this 100-dimensional space, but is it simply on a line between these two? And since we're in the Simons Institute, you all know the answer, which is that it's not. And because if it did lie on that point halfway in between, that would simply correspond to a linear superposition of this image and this image. Okay, so what we can say safely is that this image, this trajectory that it takes as the E moves across this pixel array is moving along a nonlinear manifold in the space, indicated by this red line. Okay, so this is the nature, this is sort of the nature of the data that sensory systems are confronted with. They were talking about symmetries earlier, the structure of data. So this is certainly a form of structure in the data that nervous systems are probably going to exploit. And so one interesting thing we can say about this is that if I start out at a certain point on this manifold here, x naught, and as I move along to any other point in the manifold, there's one matrix that moves me along from one point to the next, and that's given by this matrix exponential. And there's a single matrix A, which characterizes all the matrices that would move you from this point to any other point along this manifold. And the only thing that's changing is this scalar T. So T would just tell us how far along we are along the manifold, but the matrix A is not changing here all along. Okay, so it's a matrix exponential. All right, so what we can say is that, so this matrix exponential, by the way, is just we refer to as the transport operator along the manifold. So it tells us how to move between different points along the manifold. Okay, and so then this would just be another a point that's further along. All right, so the interesting thing about this is that for this E moving across this array, it corresponds to this one particular manifold. But if I had a different letter moving across that array, that would correspond to a different manifold in the space, but it would have the exact same transport operator, the exact same matrix A that moves you from one point to the next. Okay. So what that tells us is that we should be able to take any given point that comes into us, any given shape that comes into us on this array, and a more meaningful representation then would be to factorize it in terms of which manifold is it on and where is it along that manifold. Okay, so the job we have, if I start to just give you some point along this manifold, is given that point x, then what's t in this matrix exponential and what was the X? What was the original X? Was that an E? Was that an A or whatever? Okay, what was the shape? What was the shape and what was the transformation being applied to it? Okay, so basically we were faced with a factorization problem. Given X, we have to sort of figure out what these two things are. Okay, and so one example of that would be just thinking about the MNIST, something like the MNIST data set. There's actually a very simple structure to that, which is that there's 10 different shapes, and then there's a set of transformations being applied to them. Okay, so then what we're confronted with in the data is the product space of these two things. And so a more efficient representation is if we could take any given point, any given data point here, and then factorize it into these two underlying variables, or two underlying descriptors. One is the transformation which created that, and the shape that was there to begin with. Okay, so how do we do that? So the problem is that, you know, when a given organism is given is just this image I, and then it has to figure out these two things from that. And the problem is, whoops, let me just go back a slide. The matrix exponential sort of obscures a lot of mathematical complexity here. So it looks, or computational complexity, right? It looks very mathematically simple, but it's actually quite complicated to compute. It's not something you want to have to compute. And it's also very complicated to do gradient descent on and things like that. So we have to sort of think about how to simplify this factorization problem. We can, in fact, reformulate it as vector factorization by taking the matrix exponential that was inherent in this transform, the e to the as, and diagonalizing. When you diagonalize that matrix A, then you can factorize that into the product of these two matrices W, which are orthonormal matrices, and then a diagonal matrix in the center, which is composed of these complex phasors with different omegas here, but all the same S. Okay, and so once you make that step, then we can simply do a few little manipulations with these orthonormal matrices W to reduce that to a vector factorization problem. So now we can say that the problem is given this vector I, which is a representation of the image, to factorize it into this vector Z, which represents where I am along the manifold, and this other vector O, which represents the shape. Okay, and this symbol here is just indicating the Hadamard product. That's the element-wise product of these two vectors. Yeah.
So you think of S as a one-dimensional manifold?
Yes.
Or?
Yes. Well, in this simple example here, it's a one-dimensional manifold, but we would want, like for an image, we're going to be on a two-dimensional manifold, or for three-dimensional objects, then it would be three-dimensional and so forth, right? But for right now, it's just one-dimensional. Yeah, for this example. Okay, so the problem here we have in optimizing this, right? It sort of looks deceivingly simple. Like, okay, fine, I can just sort of set this as an optimization problem. Say, take like I minus this thing, quantity squared, and minimize that with respect to S, and minimize that with respect to O or alpha here, the representation of the shape. But the problem is if you just look at the representation with respect to S, this energy function of just the difference between these two things, quantity squared, it has many local minima. Okay, so if you start here, you're just going to get stuck there, right? This is where you want to be. Okay, so it's not something that's easily optimized with respect to that scalar variable. It sort of suggests that it could be, but it's not actually. And so what we actually have to think about doing is working in the space of these high dimensional vectors, so that vector Z that we just showed there is, as I mentioned before, its elements are complex phasors with these different omega values. And then we represent a particular transformation or shift X, that X is what we called S before, okay? Is just really just multiplying by X in each of these complex phasors in the exponent, okay? And so one way to think about that is that as we advance X, as we increase the value of X, then each of these phasors is spinning around on the unit circle at a different rate given by its omega value. Okay, so for two of these omegas for the first two dimensions here, what we're doing is we're just traversing the surface of a two-dimensional torus. Okay, we're moving along a one-dimensional manifold on the surface of this two-dimensional torus, and for an n-dimensional complex phasor vector, we're moving along the surface of an n-dimensional torus. Okay. And the other thing we can say about interesting property of these phasor vectors constructed this way is that they provide a nice equivariant representation of position, for example, and that they have this similarity kernel that has this nice property where the inner product between, this should be complex conjugate, by the way. So the inner product of these two vectors with different s parameters in them, x and x plus delta x, it falls off smoothly as a function of delta x, okay? So if you're in the same position, it has an inner product of 1, obviously. And as you move away, then it falls off gradually to the point where if you're a different integer position, it's orthogonal, and then actually forms a sinc function. So what you can show is even if you choose these phasors, and this is, of course, related to Ben Recht's work many years ago on Fourier features, even if you choose those omegas randomly, then you still get, approximates a sinc function kernel. Okay, and the other important property is that when you multiply Hadamard product these two vectors, that it corresponds to shifting the representation of position. Okay, so the next step is that we want to think about how to implement this in the system that works at low power and with neurons that have limited precision. Okay, and the other thing we want to be able to do is hold the representation of state. So like with the fly, we saw even when the lights are turned off, it holds that representation of state. So a useful model for that is something like a model that has attractor dynamics, like a Hopfield network. And so now we can build a Hopfield network that will hold a state of position just by following the dynamics here, by building this matrix Z that holds all the different positions that we want to represent along the manifold. And then just we have this outer product. This is just for the Hopfield weights, and then just iterating this equation. So you just update the Z's according to this equation here, which is just following the Hopfield dynamics. And it will basically, starting with a noisy vector Z, it will converge to one of these Z's that have been stored. And this is just a complex phasor generalization of the Hopfield network that was first described by Nost. Okay, and then we can do the same thing for the patterns that we want to store, like the letter E or the letter A or so forth, and store those different patterns in a matrix and have attractor dynamics that can converge to those as well and hold those as a state. And now to solve the factorization problem, we can just really couple those two attractor models together. So the problem, again, we want to solve is given this vector I to factorize it into Z and O. And so Z has to be a position along this manifold, along that n-dimensional torus, and O has to be some pattern that we are already familiar with, that we know that's in our dictionary, okay? And so what this does, so what this algorithm does, we refer to it as a resonator network, and this is a model that was developed by Pax and Frady a number of years ago and described in these papers down here. Is that at any given point in time, you have some estimate for your position and some estimate for your object. And so what you're going to do is to say, well, at any given time, then I should be able to divide I by Z, and that would give me an estimate of what the object should be, or vice versa. I could take I and divide it by O, and that should give me a position of where I am along the manifold, okay? And whatever those estimates are should be coerced to fall within the basis of attraction of these two different Hopfield networks. Okay, so what we basically have here are these two different Hopfield networks, one for position and the other for shape, that are coupled together and interact with each other. So it's a recurrent neural network we refer to as a resonator network, and it turns out that it has very excellent performance in solving these factorization problems extremely efficiently, better than gradient descent would, or other standard algorithms for doing optimization. Okay, and this is just an example of that at work. Showing an image that's been encoded this way, where you have these objects that can occur at different any given position in one of 7 different colors and 26 different letters at 50 different vertical positions and 50 different horizontal positions. And so, of course, the combinatorics of this world are huge. Okay, for one letter in a scene, there's 455,000 different combinations, yet we're representing that with a very small number of our sources, just with an alphabet or a dictionary of just 7 colors, 26 letters, and 50 plus 50 positions. Okay, so that's the advantage of factorization. Rather than swimming in a data deluge and having to sort of treat each one of these examples from the world as a different exemplar, we can factorize it into a smaller number of things that we can deal with and reason about. Okay, so then the last part, and I should check where I am on time here. Oh, okay. So then maybe I better.
Do 5 more.
Okay,
There were a lot
fine.
of
Okay,
questions.
okay. So then what I want to maybe delve into here, this is the work of Chris Kim, is how to represent the equivariant part. And so as we saw before, that ellipsoid body in the fly's brain is forming this equivariant representation of heading, where it is in the world. And rats have head direction cells in their brains, and we most likely have head direction cells in our brains. There are also cells in the rat brain that tell it give it a representation of where it is in the world, its position within some environment. And we most likely have very similar structures in our brains. And this is a discovery that was made in the early 2000s about this representation of position in the rat cortex, as this in the entorhinal cortex. They're so-called grid cells because any one of these neurons responds in a periodic fashion to different positions in the environment. Okay, so this is just showing when the rat sort of moves around this environment here, where the neuron fires. Okay, and that's for one particular neuron. This is for another neuron within a different module, and another neuron, another neuron. And what's interesting about these neurons called grid cells is not only their periodic behavior and the fact that these response fields are arranged hexagonally, which is also remarkable because, again, this is this is an area that's very deep inside the brain, is not sort of related to something like the hexagonal lattice of the cones or something like that. The brain is internally creating this representation of place. But what's also interesting about it is these scales. You notice the scale is increasing here, and these scales come in discrete steps. Okay, so it's not like a continuum. You find a cluster of neurons that has one periodicity, one spacing, and then all of a sudden jump typically to another spacing, and then a cluster of neurons that all have the same spacing, and then another cluster of spacings. And so it was suggested by Lafitte about 10 years ago that what this may constitute is a residue number representation of position in space in the two-dimensional world. These different spacings maybe correspond to like different digits in a residue number system. And so this is what Chris Kim has been working on, is developing a model for how you could represent. Yeah. Yeah, so this is another aspect that Lafitte has sort of highlighted, is that it turns out that these can form very strong error correcting codes. It's like an analog error correcting code for position. So you could have very noisy neurons here. Encoding, each of these neurons could have a lot of noise on it, and you're getting this sort of exponential error correction in the coding. So that's another sort of aspect. These two things kind of hand in hand. We'd like to understand how you're getting the error correction, and how specifically would you design a residue number system to. I'm sorry?
It's showing that for the math representations proposed, it has error correction.
It's implied that it must, because we know the neurons there have these sort of variable firing rates, and has a robust representation of space and where it is in the world. But precisely showing that error correction has actually happening in that system has not been done yet. So it's still kind of at the point of a theory. And this is the theory that's been developed by Lafitte, right? And it's a beautiful set of ideas, but yeah, it has yet to be shown that it's really actually doing that. But it's capable. I mean, it's a very plausible theory showing that it's capable of doing that. And so the idea here of residue number system is simply that you're going to represent a number here, such as 41, with respect to a set of different moduli. So for example, you could represent it mod 3, mod 5, mod 7. Okay, so that would be the representation of 41 mod 3, 41 mod 5, and 41 mod 7. And then these three digits together, even though each of them represents a number over only a very small dynamic range, they can represent the composite number that they represent can be over a very large dynamic range. In fact, that dynamic range, if these are picked to be co-prime numbers, is simply the product of those moduli. Okay, so you could represent numbers uniquely over a range of 105 using these three different moduli. Okay, so that's basically a well-known theory that has shown that. And one of the remarkable properties and very, very attractive properties of these residue number systems is that arithmetic operations can be performed element-wise. So for example, if we want to add 41 to 26, we don't have to worry about carry bit operations. We just simply add these corresponding digits of the residue numbers element-wise and that gives us a unique answer. And same thing for multiplication. Okay, it could be done element-wise without having to worry about carry operations and so forth. Okay, so in order to make this work with these complex Phasor valued vectors, it turns out all you have to do is choose the the frequencies, those omega values. Was omega before, now they're theta, but those omega values just have to be chosen from the nth roots of unity. So they have to be chosen at discrete points around the unit circle. And if you can choose them randomly again, but as long as they're chosen discretely from this set of points, then you'll end up with a similarity kernel that now has this desired modulo behavior. So again, just looking at the inner product between two vectors, it's orthogonal to all these different integers here until we wrap around and we reach the base number of the modulo system. So in this case, 7, and then it becomes the same again. Okay, so now we have a complex Phasor vector that can represent a residue number digit. And then in order to represent the composite number, we can simply multiply these complex Phasors together. Okay, so that's just the Hadamard product of these three, the mod 7, mod 5, mod 3 vector can now represent a composite vector with a dynamic range of 105. And that's just simply showing a simple animation of this happening. As we take this value of x and advance it, then each of these residue number systems is simply incrementing in this modulo fashion, but then the composite number has a much larger dynamic range. Okay, so it's again, we get this property where by combining a small number of things with a limited dynamic range, we get a very sort of large product space of things which we can describe. In this case, a set of numbers and positions in the world. Okay, and then so that's the construct. So given that you want to have these three different residue number digits, that's how you get the composite number. And then going backwards, if you're given some representation of a number, you can break it down into its residue number systems by simply using this resonator network that I talked about before. It amounts to a factorization problem, right? We have to take this composite number and factorize it in terms of its residue numbers with those base 3, 5, 7. Okay, so and so what Chris has shown remarkably is that this has a very good scaling properties, so it comes very close to achieving this exponential scaling property that's known to exist for residue numbers. And in terms of the associative memory dynamics, we're getting quadratic scaling or close to quadratic scaling in terms of the capacity, the number of patterns we can store, and the number of positions we can store in this recurrent neural network. And this is all described in a number of publications that Chris has coming out, one in neural computation and another that'll be presented at NeurIPS in December. Okay, so I think I have to wrap up, but it's also, gets to the error correction. We haven't been able to show we haven't delved into whether it has the same kind of strong exponential error correction properties that Elafid has shown, but that's something we're working on. But right now, for what we can see is we can add tons of Phasor noise, tons of phase noise to those complex Phasors, and it exhibits very robust performance still in terms of being able to do arithmetic and update its representations to shift in position. Okay, there's more we could say about how then we can go from beyond one dimension, how we can form these two-dimensional representations of two-dimensional space by working with a Mercedes-Benz frame, coding position in triangular coordinates. And it turns out this coding in triangular coordinates is much more efficient than coding in rectangular coordinates. So instead of using north, south, east, west, it's more efficient to use just 3 vectors encoding where you're heading, or you're moving in space, or your position. And this is just showing the benefit you get. So you get, for the same number of neural resources, you get a much higher dynamic range and coding capacity for 2D space as opposed to rectangular coordinates. All right, so I think I better wrap it up there. And so I think what I tried to convey is that there's a lot that we can learn from small brains about how animals have to deal with the physical world, with the complexity of the physical world, and the novel situations that are handed to it by the physical environment. And that thinking about how brains do these computations is going to require thinking about the physics of computation at the same time. So what are these sort of natural primitives that you can compute with neurons and so forth? And these problems of factorization, in perception, we're making headway on, and in terms of forming these equivariant representations of where you are in the world, you're heading, and so forth, and updating those representations in a stable and robust way is going to benefit from this. Right.
One question.
Atus, yeah.
I'd like to push back a little bit on this hypothesis that natural systems try to separate the hardware and the software by looking at the human brain, which between the ages of 6 and 12 months cuts a bunch of synapses. And so it's treating the human brain in a more sort of software and general computation way within like this special pre-cooked way, like in the library. Could you comment on this?
Could you say a little bit more about like
So
the
like,
6 and
like
7?
like the one sentence version,
Yeah.
the 300 sentence version is, you were saying that there's like a hardware software connection for the fly brain, but I'm proposing that the human brain, it actually is more like a generic computational substrate, which doesn't have a lot of pre-wiring, and that my justification for this is the synaptic cut that happens between 6 and 12 months in a child.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. But it's the synaptic cut you're referring to. That like there's a sort of like big step in development that occurs.
Yeah, there's a bunch of synapses just stop that were firing a lot, just stop firing between 6 and 12 months.
Or stop getting used, and there's sort of like the critical period of plasticity and so forth. Yeah, we have those kinds of things happening in the system. That, again, I would just say that a lot of this structure we see in the cortex, these circuits, it's not like you're born with a pile of mush and then it has to create all these circuits de novo, right? That layer, that canonical microcircuit is something you're born with, right? You don't sort of learn to end up wiring it a different way. And so the details of that definitely, like the fine-grained details of how the synaptic strengths and so forth, those definitely change over time. But the algorithmic structure, things like grid cells and so forth, that's not sort of learned in every animal de novo. It's something that you're born with, and so many of these structures are it's not like you just start with random weights and go from there. Yes.
Thank you for
All right.
for the fascinating talk.